I'm, again, Doug Banks. I'm the executive editor of the Boston Business Journal. I've been in business journalism in Boston since 1998. So I've, prior to being the executive editor here at the BBJ, I was the editor and then publisher of Mass High Tech. We covered tech and life sciences companies in Boston. I've been at Fast Company magazine and others, and did some time in economic development between stints. So a couple of different spaces. I have the pleasure of moderating the conversation on the next wave. So Susan Coleman, who is to my immediate left, has written this book called The Next Wave, Financing Women's Growth-Oriented Firms. And next to her, who, as I will introduce, are 3 live case studies that will bring to life the book while we're discussing some of the issues around financing growth-oriented firms. So what I'd like to do is we'll get started. I'm grateful that I don't have 4 books the way Larry just had to be able to bounce back and forth. I can't imagine. He did such a great job this morning. So I'm just going to hope I can keep up with Larry, as I guess most of us hope we can keep up with Larry. So to my immediate left is Susan Coleman. She's a professor at the University of Hartford. She's the author of this book. What I'm going to have each of these panelists do is just give a very brief, 30-second introduction to sort of, what you do, who you are, as this relates to the context of our conversation, and then we'll get started, and I'll launch in with some statistics, some numbers, and some questions. So to my immediate left is Susan Coleman. Next to her is Kate Castle, founder of Xfactor Ventures. Next to her is Janis, the co-founder of the Refinery, among at least a dozen hats that I can tell from the bio that I looked at and from conversations. And then next to her is Clarke, founder of the Impact Seat and also wearer of many hats. So why don't you just give us a quick introduction to sort of who you are, what brings you to this conversation, and then we'll go from there.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm delighted to see so many people and have this opportunity to participate with these distinguished panelists. As Doug said, I'm a professor of finance at the University of Hartford, and I teach both corporate finance and entrepreneurial finance at the undergraduate and graduate levels. I've been doing research on women-owned firms for about 30 years. So I'm one of the old people in the women-owned firms research business. When you're an academic, you are always looking for things to say that somebody else hasn't already said. And when I was looking around for research topics 30 years ago, nobody was writing about women-owned firms. And about half of the students in my classes were women. And I thought, well, this is odd. And I thought there's a story out there that deserves to be told. So I started doing research on women-owned firms shortly after Candy Brush at Babson did. And many of you will know Candy if you have followed the research in this area. And it's really been not only professionally rewarding for me, but very personally rewarding. And that's how I ended up here today, and I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, Susan. Kate?
Thanks. I'm Kate Castle. I wear 2 hats these days. My primary role is as marketing partner at Flybridge Capital Partners, which is an early stage venture capital firm here in Boston focused on the tech industry. I've been in the venture capital industry for 15 years now. And I'm one of 7% of women that are in partner roles at venture firms today. And that number needs to increase if we're going to change the way women get funded and women entrepreneurs getting funded. Earlier this year, as part of that, I helped launch a new fund called Xfactor Ventures with one of the general partners at Flybridge. It is a $3 million venture fund focused on investing in female founders, really at their earliest stages. What we found when we talked to female entrepreneurs is they run into 2 things, one of which is the first check is often the hardest check to get, and if you can get that first check, it can often help them catalyze getting the next couple $100,000 for that first round if it's $500,000 or less. And so being able to go in and say, here's $100,000 and get that in. Second, we heard that timeframes are of the essence, and if you're going out to raise your initial round, going through 6, 8, 9 months and then being told a no can break a company. And so being able to make quick decisions to help them do that. We when putting together the fund, we were looking at trying to make sure we get more female investors into the ecosystem as well as more female founders funded. And so we went and we recruited 9 female founders who are all operating their own companies right now, and very much doing this as a second job as well. And they are in the investment team, and we felt that they bring a unique network amongst themselves of female founders that deal flow into the table, probably deals that we typically wouldn't be seeing. And our hope is that with this, we'll have a new class of female investors out there that hopefully will enter into the venture ecosystem once they exit their companies, and we get 30 new female entrepreneur companies funded, and hopefully some of these will be awesome companies that are growing massive opportunities, and our focus is investing in companies that have the potential for growth and venture returns.
And we're going to talk a lot more about the movement from entrepreneur to investor. It's obviously a keystone to the book, and we're going to definitely get into that soon. Okay, Janis.
So I'm Janis Collins, and I'm an investor, a startup advisor, and the co-founder of the Refinery. And in 2011 to 2013, you've probably heard that women-led companies got less than 2.7% of venture funding. So we started the Refinery as an accelerator program to uncover high growth potential women-led tech companies, help them grow and develop a funding and growth strategy to become a high potential company, and then invest in them. So we've been operating for 4 years. We've had 5 cohorts, 39 companies. They've raised $20 million. Many times they come into our program, they have a high growth potential idea that we think could be really big. They don't necessarily think that way yet. They think about a $2 million company, not a $20 million company. And we help them put all the pieces in place to become that $20 to $50 million company. I'm also an investor in the Flybridge Xfactor fund, because I really believe that what we need is more women in venture capital. And we, the Refinery, do everything we can to support the growth of women as partners in venture capital. And I love the approach that they took, which was to recruit CEOs of venture-backed companies to be on their investment committee, to help to learn how to make investments. And I think that's crucial to really building investments in female-founded companies. Early in my career, I was a technologist, one of the oldest on the planet. And I had a boss named John Chambers, who became later the CEO of Cisco Routers. He totally invested in me, trained me in executive leadership as well as negotiation strategies, and hired an executive coach for me. This was many years ago. And so I believe that that's what it takes to really get women into leadership positions and get them funded. And that's the approach we take at the Refinery.
Super, thank you, Janis. Barbara?
Hi, I'm Barbara Clarke. My first part of my career was at KPMG and PricewaterhouseCoopers. As an economist, I evaluated intellectual property. So I've always been really interested in what drives value for companies, because often it's hidden sometimes. I'm an angel investor. Well, and the other piece too is I've also always been part of really diverse teams, and that's sort of a lot of the stuff I do today. As an angel investor, I have about 30 companies in my personal portfolio. I'm part of 3 funds on the investment committee, and I like the funds because it really is like an amplifying effect for your voice. 100% of the companies I invest in have a woman on the founding team. It's really easy to do. There's tons of them out there. And then last year, I especially started focusing on women of color on my founding teams. And again, pretty easy to do. There's lots of deal flow. I have companies, my investments are in all across the United States and in Europe. I invest early money. Sometimes I'm the first money in, and I'll go all the way up through multiple rounds into like the alphabet soup of ABCs and all that stuff.
That is fantastic. Okay, so let me just have offer up a couple of statistics that I just pulled in the last couple of weeks. And Kate, you'll be happy to know that according to Crunchbase, their list of top 100 venture firms, the percentage of women partners has now gone to 8% from 7%. So that progress that you asked for in the past 18 months is it ticked up one point. So let's let's take it for what it is, which is one small step of growth.
From really pathetic to pathetic.
Exactly. So to put it another way, if you think about a top 100 list of venture firms, 58 of the venture firms on their list had no female partners. So that was a slightly better improvement of 62 firms that had no female partners 18 months earlier. But 8 firms in their top 100 added a female partner for the first time. And women now hold 15% of the partner roles at accelerators and corporate venture firms. So the strategics are at 15%, so almost twice as many as a percentage, which is still pretty pathetic, but we're getting there. And that represented a 25% improvement over the last 18 months. And then in terms of micro venture funds, you'll be interested to know, over the last 3 years, women founded 16 micro venture funds, 21% of all the new firms in the category of micro ventures. 10% of venture dollars globally between 2012 and the third quarter of 2017 went to startups with at least one woman founder. So interesting. Of course, there's lots of data in the book, The Next Wave, and so my first question is to Susan. The book is called, again, The Next Wave, Financing Women's Growth-Oriented Firms. This is it. You get it in the back after our talk. Could you talk a little bit, this is not your first rodeo, it's not your first book. Can you talk a little bit about how The Next Wave differs from your first book, which was called A Rising Tide? This one focuses more on growth companies. Just talk a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 key points related to why you chose women and growth companies, growth-oriented startups for us.
That's a great question, Doug. I was writing A Rising Tide just as we were coming out of the Great Recession. And it was a very grim economic time. And I'm kind of a glass half full kind of person. I wanted to find a happy story to tell. And there was a lot of research on why things weren't working and why firms were failing and why there weren't enough women. And I thought, okay, let's look at it from the other perspective. Let's look at it from a glass half full perspective and look at the women who are pursuing entrepreneurship and are successful at entrepreneurship on their terms. In The Rising Tide, we focused on women-owned firms in a broad range of industries and at a broad range of developmental stages. Many of those firms were what we would call lifestyle firms. And lifestyle firms are firms that start small and for the most part stay small. And that's typically because that's the way the entrepreneur wants it. She wants to focus on something she can really become an expert at. She wants to serve her local community. She wants to juggle different competing responsibilities, or she just doesn't want the added stress that comes with high growth. So many of the firms in that first book were lifestyle firms. And those firms are very important because essentially we tend to be obsessed with growth. And an entrepreneur can be successful in many different ways. And the message we were trying to convey in A Rising Tide is that you as a woman can be successful in entrepreneurship on your own terms. Don't let somebody else define the terms of success for you. Define your own terms and achieve your own success. When we finished A Rising Tide, there was one chapter in Rising Tide on growth-oriented firms. And when we finished the book, I really felt uncomfortable because I really felt like we hadn't done justice to that particular segment of women's entrepreneurship. And a couple of years had passed, because it takes you a couple of years to write a book. And the economy was still changing, and there were some exciting changes, both structurally, economically, but also culturally. And there was a lot more focus economically on growth-oriented firms at the national level because of their job creation potential. But there was also a lot more focus on growth-oriented firms being launched by women. So women were starting to get visibility in ways they had not previously gotten before. And my co-author, Alicia Robb, and I looked each other in the eye and we said, the time is right, let's do it again. So that's why we started the next wave. We wanted to devote a book specifically to growth-oriented firms and to, again, tell the successful stories of how are women achieving success in this very challenging growth-oriented sector.
Thank you, Susan. So you mentioned that the timing is right. That's actually a great segue to one of the questions that I have, which is just really a very basic question. We are hearing more and more about women-owned firms, more and more about women-owned startups, more and more about funds like Xfactor, brand new, and the other firms here. Why? What's going on that's different today, and why is there so much excitement? And that is a question for any of you. You can all banter that back and forth. Why now? Why is the time right?
So I'm going to give my, 2 cents on it, and I'm sure Susan would agree with this. So we are 50% of the population, women. More and more women are starting companies. We've now surpassed men in achievement of PhDs, offering the opportunity to commercialize that science. And we own 51% of the U.S. wealth in U.S. wealth. So women are an important factor in our economic growth. And I think even Lisa Mitchell from Kauffman Foundation had a great quote, which is, this is an economic imperative to really support, and if we don't, really, we're leaving the economic growth by the wayside, right? So that women are really going to be the drivers of the future of our economic growth. So I just think we've achieved that point of having more capabilities, more science, more education, and more wealth in the United States. So that's my viewpoint on this, and why now, and why is now important.
Yeah, there's also another really interesting trend. In high growth companies years ago, it was very much business to business, and it was really like a CTO to CTO conversation. And so for the VCs, it really mattered that they knew who the most important CTOs are. Now if you think about just the tremendous power that consumers have exerted, like we are the consumers of phones. It's not our company telling us what to buy necessarily. Thinking about Slack, where you can have individual teams make a decision to adopt something. It's a very consumer-driven model. And women are the purchasers of the vast majority of product. In some areas, it's like 90%. Even in areas you might not expect, where it's a much more consumer-driven economy. And so now women can really have much more of an amplifying effect with the dollars that they have.
I think there's also been a lot of recent studies have come out that show that having gender diverse or women on your team actually is better for your company. It drives greater revenues, and the success of that, and as people see that, and if you're a public company and have shareholders, it means something to have that diversity on your team.
Well, I just have to say, I laugh because, as an economist, and when I start with studying economics, you're sort of at the beginning of behavioral economics, and people start to question, like, markets aren't rational, whatever. And that fact alone tells you that markets aren't rational, because the data is done. Like, diverse teams, women on your team, women on your board, that's done. That research has been done a million times. And the fact that there hasn't been this complete sea change. I'm a big baseball fan, love Moneyball, and it's just amazing how that hasn't been adopted. So that tells you that the system has a lot of problems.
We heard a little bit about this morning. Sadal's book on the language of global success is very much about diversity of thought, bringing in different ideas and being able to communicate it in ways that people wouldn't have otherwise heard the same message, whether it's through data or whether it's through their own eyes or whether it's through a consumer-driven economy. The words that we use and the way we do it are going to speak to our successes, and so therefore, obviously, Kate, to your point, and others,
I think too that you're seeing it's not just in entrepreneurship or technology, but you're just seeing a general rising of women's voices saying we are not going to sit back anymore, and we're going to start being the change. And I have never seen more sort of women's groups and mentoring and things that I just haven't seen, and women are standing up and saying, we've got to work together to make this change.
Right. I think that's true.
So, Kate, as it turns out, about just a few weeks ago, I happened to moderate a panel where your partner, Jeff Busgang, was on the panel, and he was talking about the idea, the panel topic was inclusive capital, which is a term that does discuss very much about investing in diverse areas, and he was raving about Xfactor, talking about, you know, Kate and her partners, the idea of investing $100,000 in 30 female-led startups, but one of the things that he made clear, and this is where my question is going, is this is no affirmative action play. This is not, hey, this is the right thing to do, therefore we'll do it. That's not what the point is. This is very much a business play, that there was this area that could be, you know, in venture terms, exploited, right? Go after opportunity. It was an opportunity play. Could you talk a little bit more about the business standpoint? And then Susan, I would love to hear from you and bring about some of the research from your book on why this is a business imperative, not necessarily something that just plays well on social media.
Sure, I mean, as with Rising Tide, that was probably those businesses that are more the $1 million, $2 million. Those are venture-backed companies. Venture funds need to have venture returns, which shows that these funds are going to return massive amounts of capital, and that's got to be companies that are in these, we see huge market opportunities, there's going to be growth here. And so, you know, as we said, this is an affirmative action, this isn't a charity fund, this is, we want to go after women founders who are going after billion-dollar opportunities. And so, you know, I think there's different areas, and you could probably talk to this as well, but, you know, different funds go after different sectors, and this is very much the venture fund, and it's something that, a market that I don't think has been, you know, there's a ton of people out there doing.
So, you know, when we work with high growth potential companies and we're really talking to them about how to talk to investors, right? So the first thing we say to them, what's in it for me, right? You've got to talk to an investor about what's in it for them. What is the economic return? Because this is not charity. This is not a donation. We're not going to invest in you because you've got a high burn rate, right? Or you haven't got paid a salary. We're going to invest in you because you're going to return at least 10x on my money. And I think that's what we really try to just really get our CEOs to really focus on. What's in it for me, the investor.
What I tell my students is venture capitalists are financial intermediaries. They're basically investing somebody else's money. And when you invest somebody else's money, your primary objective is not charity, not being a good guy or a good gal, but basically delivering a return to your investors. The research shows that, you know, for Next Wave, we interviewed a lot of different women entrepreneurs that had pursued both angel financing and venture capital. Sometimes they dealt with women investors, sometimes they dealt with male investors. And what they said fairly consistently is we either got funding or we didn't get funding based on the strength of our business model and our leadership team. The women said we didn't get a break because we were women. You know, when we were dealing with women VCs, they weren't easier on us because we were women. They expected exactly the same stuff from us they would expect from the guys, which of course is the answer you would want as a finance professor. But that's the way it works in truth. And from a venture capitalist perspective, you really can't afford to leave money on the table, which is what you're doing if you ignore women-led or women-founded firms. And that's just not good investing sense.
Just can I add like a nerd data point too? The Kauffman Foundation did a great report a couple of years ago called, I think, We've Seen the Enemy and It Is Us. And it showed that half of all venture firms don't even return capital, like the capital of the fund, as I cough. And then a quarter of them don't, you know, have market returns. So it's really just a small percentage of venture firms that are actually returning these outsized profits. So there's 75% of that market could learn how to invest better.
One thing that I think when I read Susan's book that I found super interesting and what we've seen with Xfactor is the impact that your social capital as you're growing your business is huge. And a data point as we got Xfactor off the ground, Chip Hazard, who's the general partner that worked on the fund with me, went back and looked at his deal flow from July of last year through December of last year. And when he looked at his deal flow, he had 90% of all new meetings he took with founders were with male founders and 10% were with females. We kicked off Xfactor in January, and he made one change to sort of his outreach of what he did is he picked up the phone and he called 10 to 15 female founders that he had relationships with, and he said, who are the 10 to 15 women in your networks that I should be talking to that I'm not? And through that, he's, over the past 6 months, taken it to a 50-50 ratio of the new business meetings he takes. And it showed in his part, like, just changing his pattern of behavior. VCs are very much, they work within their networks, and if they're looking at a deal or interested in a market, they pick up the phone, and most of the VCs are men, they call their male friends, and it tends to be this cycle that goes around and around. And so it takes sort of a change in pattern of behavior. But I think female founders also have to see that, you know, if they're going in, they need to make sure they're going into this social network where they don't have those connections, and so do everything possible that they can to make those connections. And, you know, Guilt Group, I think, was one of the examples that Susan gave in her book. And, you know, look at how you structure your team. If you don't have the connections there, then find somebody on your team that does.
So thank you very much for that, because that's actually the where I wanted to go next, which is some of the case studies that you have in your book. Guilt Group at Harvard was a good example. Maria Serino at 406 Ventures, Helen Grainer. When you got to the chapter on IPOs and going for gold, you talked about iRobot. Give us a sense of that. But I think social capital is a great place to sit for a minute and talk a little bit more about that when it comes to growth-oriented startups and what you saw in your book.
That also is an excellent theme. What we talk about in the book is essentially a three-legged stool that's composed of human capital, which is education and experience, financial capital, money, and also social capital, which is your connections and contacts. As my colleagues have said, women have made tremendous strides over the last generation in the areas of human capital, education, and experience. They've also made tremendous strides in the area of financial capital. The area where women are still struggling is in the area of social capital, getting into those networks which traditionally have been very male-dominated, knowing the right people, knowing the right contacts. And a lot of the initiatives that are underway now designed to expand the entrepreneurial ecosystem in ways that will benefit women are very much targeted toward that social capital element, finding ways for women to not only prepare themselves through skills and development and team building, but also how to connect with those key resources that can provide financial capital, key employees, connections with suppliers or buyers or the like. And that's really where a lot of the action is occurring right now. A few years ago, just to give you an example, a few years ago we had something like 7 or 8 women accelerators in the United States. There are over 70 now. And those are entities that are preparing women to ask for financial capital. They're getting them investment ready in a variety of ways. And in addition to that skill development, they're providing the connections. There's the leading researcher on angel financing in the UK is a guy named Richard Harrison, who's just brilliant. I just love him. And he has an article that's coming out, I think in Small Business Economics. But he said the entrepreneurial ecosystem, people think of it as a thing, as a place, as a basket of resources. But it's really not that. It's the resources, but it's also the processes that connect entrepreneurs to those resources. And you have to have those processes in place. You can't just have the resources, because if you just have the resources, a lot of people aren't going to be able to get at them.
And we're going to talk about access to capital next, but I want to make sure Janis gets her point in too.
Yeah, because I want to make a few points about it. So when we started the refinery, one of the very specific things that we had in mind was how do we share our networks. So my colleague, co-founder Jen Gabler, and myself, we were women in traditional male roles in terms of our careers. I was the managing director at JP Morgan. She was the CFO of venture-backed health tech companies. So what we did from the get-go is extend our networks to our entrepreneurs, right? So that was really important. And our network wasn't just other women, it was men. So that's the second key point. We need men at the table to make this change. because the world is 50-50. So we brought in at least 50% of our mentors are men, and they are investors as well. So we believe that we're not very much focused on these all-women organizations. We want to see both parties at the table. So that's another key point. The other thing that's changing is that we've just did something different this year. We run a pitch competition. Last year was our first one. This was our second annual pitch competition, solely for the purpose of uncovering these high growth potential tech companies led by women. So this year was different because instead of doing one big final pitch competition, we did it within each local territory, local city. One in Boston, one in Hamden, Connecticut, one in Newark, New Jersey. Why? Because integrating within the local entrepreneurial ecosystem is critical. So not to be a separate women for women only group, but to be a part of that entrepreneurial ecosystem. And we see that change happening, which is a really positive thing. Yeah.
That's huge.
And Susan, in your book, you gave some examples of some of the barriers that still exist to access to capital. So you can start all the funds, in the world, and and accelerators and women-focused things. But as you mentioned, it's not a basket full of goodies that they can just reach in and get. It's more of a network or a web of access. So talk a little bit about the barriers that you found in your research or your book, and how they can be and are becoming overcome.
When you think about access to financial capital, there's a demand side to it and a supply side to it. The demand side is the entrepreneur willing and ready to ask for the financial capital she needs? And does she ask for enough? The supply side are there the structural components there that will channel financial capital to qualified women entrepreneurs? And what we found was challenges on both the supply and the demand side. On the demand side, what we found, and this was confirmed by other research, by interviews we did, both with entrepreneurs and with venture capitalists and with angel investors. Women frequently are reluctant to ask for money. They underestimate their financial needs. They think, oh, I can be thrifty, I can get by. And when they do ask, they don't ask for enough. Other individuals would tell us, a woman can have an absolutely fantastic idea for a business, but she doesn't have a big enough vision. As we said, she thinks it's a $2 million business when it's a $200 million business. So part of it is that demand side, helping women learn how to recognize the potential of their business, learn how to think long term and have an entrepreneurial vision, and ask for what they need when they need it. As women, we're trained to sort of, particularly my generation, oh, you don't need that, be thrifty, try to get by. But that's not necessarily the way to run a growth-oriented firm. On the supply side, some of the barriers that you encounter are the fact that both the angel investor space and the venture capital space, which are essential for growth-oriented entrepreneurship, have historically been very male-dominated. The reason that's a problem for women is because of something that's called homophily. And homophily refers to the fact that likes are attracted to likes. If you're a male investor, you're just a lot more comfortable investing in other males and the kinds of businesses they start, which means you're more likely to invest in men and less likely to invest in women. The cure for that is to create, first of all, to sensitize men to that's what they're doing, because sometimes you don't realize you're doing something. You point it out to somebody, you're missing out on all these women. Oh yeah, let me fix that. But another cure is to increase the number of women angel investors and VCs. Because if we increase the pool of women investors, we increase the likelihood that women entrepreneurs will get seen. We'll get recognized, and ultimately we'll get funded.
On that point, I think one thing that, people will say, well, there's just not enough women out there to recruit onto their teams. And You know, when you look at, I think for the earlier stage VC firms, you don't need to have someone who's been in a venture firm and has that finance background. For us, a huge part of it is actually someone who's deeply embedded in the entrepreneur community, who has unique deal flow and the network they're going to bring in. But it is important to us that they have some kind of investing experience. And so whether they're angel investing on their own or putting a little bit of money in, to know that there's some base level there of they get how the market works. And you know, when folks go out, they might find women who are deeply embedded in the entrepreneurial community, but the pool of people who have had the success from either selling their companies or being the founders that got funded, that can now have the capital to start the angel investing, is pretty small. And so, you know, I think there's multiple sides to this that we've got to try to solve for, which is we need more women here that are getting funded, that have the ability to sell their companies and start investing on their own. And then you need more women investors over here, and so that it's a cycle that keeps going around.
Yeah, but and I agree.
Just really quickly, because we're running out of time and I got to get to questions. But go ahead. I want to make sure you get your point in before we go. So be thinking of your questions, folks, because I'm coming to you next. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, just re-emphasizing Susan's point that a lot of women really focus on developing product, and don't necessarily go out and ask for money. So, and don't necessarily have the confidence or the network to ask for that money. So programs that really focus on how to raise capital and how to teach a CEO that's a female founder how to raise capital, have confidence in the numbers, see the big vision, and then walk in with swagger into a VC is really important.
I'm amazed at how many female founders come in. Male founders at the end of the meeting will typically say, so what are next steps and how much are you going to invest? And it's harder for female founders to make that, like, leave the meeting with an ask.
And we know there's lots of studies about how women have been evaluated differently. I was just going to say about social capital. I've been very intentional about that. My main angel group I'm with is Astia, which is based in San Francisco. It's 50% men, women. That's why I do invest across the country. I want to see all the deals across the country. I don't want to burrow deeply into Boston. Because I want to be able to say, like, I do know that that company is better because I saw this company in LA and I saw this company in Atlanta. So I've been very, very, very intentional about that. And I do tell all the CEOs, make sure, like, you know, ask me if I want to invest, and then what are our next steps?
Yeah,
Definitely.
Excellent. All right. Real quick, we're in the home stretch, folks. I see Larry with his microphone. So yes, sir. He's coming right behind you with the mic.
I'm Warren Cross. I'm a new trustee at Babson College, and my question is, the past two incoming freshman class, the women now are greater than the men coming in, which is fantastic. And my question to you is, what can we do, or what can a place like Babson do, which has been the #1 entrepreneurial school for 21 years in a row? What can we do to enhance the experience for the women and not just have them go into finance? And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that, but to literally want to start their own companies. And how can we help sort of engage that even more? Because I'm enthralled by it. I think it could be very interesting.
Yeah.
Great question.
That's a question I've been wrestling with for 30 years. When I started teaching entrepreneurial finance, I was using case studies. Half my students were women. For the life of me, I could not find an entrepreneurial finance case study with a male in it, with a woman in it. They were all about males. Eventually, I wrote a few myself. But in the last few years, more and more have come out. And this year, I've completely revised my syllabus for that course, and at least half of the case studies are about women. I bring in newspaper articles about women. I play videos from the ACA website on women. I played yours, Barbara, on due diligence. And so they see women in these entrepreneurial and decision-making roles. Another thing that I think is really good at the educational level is that students are doing a lot more in teams. And they're doing a lot more in mixed gender teams. And when you're in a team and your grade depends on the performance of the team, you want the best people on that team. And you don't care if it's a male or a female. So what I'm seeing is a lot of the recognition of women's capabilities through these kinds of team activities. I think another factor that's happening, and you're probably seeing it at Babson as well, but I certainly saw it at the Refinery pitch I went to last year. Young women think about themselves differently. They, Janis, at this Refinery pitch, about a lot of the entrepreneurs were young women, and they were just coming out of the bullpen ready to take on the world, and the world was their oyster. So, women are thinking of themselves as more capable and more empowered. But I would say there are a lot of things you can, and you've got great people at Babson.
One thing I will say is that when we launched Xfactor, the work you guys are doing at Babson already, I think is far ahead of what a lot of the other people with the Win Labs and Susan Duffy and you guys are doing a great job. That I think you've got a good, foothold out there, and it's continuing to build on that.
But to the extent that you can incorporate diversity into your faculty, which you do,
Yes.
and also into your curriculum,
Yes.
which I'm sure you do, that really sets the stage in terms of how young women think about themselves and how young men think about women.
I've just said one thing, I don't think enough time is spent talking about team formation and who's on the founding team. And there's so much of the duplicates on the team. And teams, products will change, solutions will change, but if you have a really good team, the team can weather it, and you really want to have a diverse team. And so where, especially some of these university pitch competitions where it's a 10-week program, whatever, they should spend 5 weeks figuring out if they have the right team. Not, do it the first weekend and then they go on. Because I see it time and time again, the weakest pitches are from these really homogeneous teams that don't understand the problem, the market. They don't have the diversity of skill on their team to really create an interesting solution.
That is fantastic. We could continue,
Yep.
but I have time for just one more question, and it's going to Bobby. Go ahead. Stand up and ask your...
I'm actually going to ask kind of the same question that I asked at the last panel that you moderated on this topic. And kudos to you, Kate, because you actually already partially answered this. So I asked Jeff the question, we all know that the warm intros are what get entrepreneurs and startups into the right people. So Barbara, you guys, you're all getting these warm intros, and part of it comes from the network. What can we do to educate the existing network that makes those warm introductions versus just expanding into other areas?
And consider this your speed round. This is a quick answer because I'm getting the hook.
Oh wait, don't go.
Great question.
What do you mean by
But yeah.
existing? What do you mean by existing?
So right now, the lawyers, the CPAs, the marketing firms are the people who make the warm intros into the money, okay? This is where a lot of the deal flow comes from. Everybody says, find a person who knows me, who can vouch for you, and often they are just not bringing women to the forefront.
So Bobby's question, especially Janis and Barbara, you were in the big four firms. You know the lack of women in those areas, in those firms, for example, the lawyers, the accountants, the bankers, who bring a lot of the deals to you. So talk a little bit about the diversity there and how we can fix that.
I'm responsible for all my warm intros.
Yeah,
that's
I do,
what
I do, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I do
I
too.
just make shit happen.
Yeah. I'm like a bull in a china
Yeah.
shop. Barbara and I are both bulls in a china shop. So
No,
we
we're
just
not.
make But anyway, we make those warm intros happen, right?
And I actually, for example, there's an entrepreneur coming to town from Texas on Friday, and I sent a bunch of emails out. She replied back to me. She says, never has an investor made so many emails in which they all replied. Every single one of them, and they almost all are taking the meeting.
I think
So
there's also knowing when you're making the warm intros, making the right warm
Yeah.
intros,
Yes.
because
Yes.
if you can sort of be viewed, there are people that make a ton of warm intros,
Yeah.
but if they're completely irrelevant or they're just not a fit for it. And so when I make a warm intro, I want to make sure I'm making one
Absolutely.
that actually is going to be a good intro, not just a warm intro.
And
But
the
I
double,
think-
the
yeah.
double opt intro, that's the other, please do that, where you email me and say, Barbara, I would like to introduce you to this person. Can I do that?
Yes.
Yes.
And then I will say
always
yes
do
or
that.
no.
Just don't make the intros blindly.
Oh,
Yes,
right,
I
right.
hate that.
Yeah.
I always do that. But to your question, I don't rely on that old network at all. I think that's the answer.
You don't.
I don't, but I don't think the entrepreneurs should. I think that's a mistake to rely on that old network. I don't think they're going to get to the people they need to get to. I think they need a new model. They need people like all of us here at the table. And we're willing to share our connections if we do
And
it
make
correctly.
more, like every day, make
Yes.
more, more.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Susan, you get the last word.
Consistent with our current speed dating format, we have 2 bullet point recommendations in the book. One is network strategically, which gets at what Kate was saying. You know, in other words, don't waste a lot of time meeting people that can't get you the resources you need to make your firm successful. The other is pay it forward. If you've been successful as an entrepreneur or as a professional, reach out your hand and help along those people, those women who are coming along behind you, because it makes a big difference. And that's, you know, lots of times you see people that make it and it's like, okay, I made it, you know, I'm done. No, you aren't. You got to help those other people too. That's part of how the cycle works.
And that transition from entrepreneur to investor is really the key point in the next wave, financing women's growth-oriented firms. When you get to the back of the book, it takes you from, you know, the entire life cycle from startup through IPO, case studies in each chapter, and at the end, we see what we have before us, which is the real-life version of that, from entrepreneur straight to investor and beyond. Will you please join me in thanking Susan and Kate and Janis and Barbara? In the back of the room, as Larry has instructed me, there are copies of Susan's books. She will be there to sign them for you and to talk to you. And then next up, Innovating with Humanity and Humor. I'm being told 5 minutes. 5 minutes break.